Hi everybody, it's Julissa again, and yes, I do have my coffee, but you won't be seeing much of this because today I'm going to show you how to take this piece of silver and turn it into a ring. So stay tuned. I'll see you in the next frame. Bye. Okay everybody, the first thing we're going to do is gather our supplies. The first thing you want to do is get your pickle pot turned on. Get it ready. It needs to be warm. You also want to get your tanks ready. If you have a dual oxygen propane tank like I do, mine is a Smith Little Torch, this handy dandy little guy right here. So I have mine set at 6 pounds here for the oxygen. You can see it's a little bit higher than 6 pounds, but when I turn it on, it'll be 6 pounds. And also the same thing for my propane, which is also 6 pounds, a little bit higher when the torch is turned off, but it will be at 6 pounds once I turn it on. You need an igniter or a trusty handy dandy lighter will work. Make sure it works. And then a few supplies for safety. You need tweezers so you don't burn your little fingertips. You need a solder pick so you can move things around if you need to while the metal is still hot. And most importantly, I know they don't look like much, but this is a pair of didymium glasses, and they're typically used by lamp workers. And the reason I use them is because it helps to protect your eyes from the sharp orange glare that you get from your torch and the silver. So I highly recommend these. I think I got these from Devarty Glass for about $28, $30, something like that. And it will help protect your eyes in the long run. Otherwise, you'll end up like a welder and be blind later on in life. So highly, highly, highly recommend these. As for the supplies for actually making your ring, you're going to need a ring mandrel, something that you can shape. I have a flex shaft and these little sanding discs that I'll use to do all my sanding, but if you don't have those, you can also use sanding sticks like I've got prepared here. All it is a paint stick from Home Depot. Haha, no intentional plug there. And a piece of sandpaper wrapped around it and taped on it with masking tape. The next thing you're going to need is a file because you're going to want to file off all the sharp edges. You'll also need a pair of half-round pliers. Now, I like the half-round pliers because it makes it easier to bend the ring into the shape that you need in order to solder it, but you can always use round nose pliers or even just your regular old straight pliers. Whatever you use to bend your rings is perfectly fine. And last but not least, you need to have a caliper, whether it's digital or dial, it's up to you. Just whichever one you use the best. It took me a little while to learn how to use that one because you actually have to use a little brain power to read the dial. But anyway, those are the basic supplies you're going to need. Oh wait, and you're going to need a piece of silver. And I set mine down again, so I'll have to find it before we go on to the next step. So I will also put a listing of the supplies that I've used here today down below in the video, and I'll also throw up a little list up here to the side. So stay tuned for the next part. So the first thing we need to do is find your scrap piece of metal. We're going to make some measurements and mark it out so we know exactly where to cut it with the jeweler saw, and then start getting to work. One of the things that I use that has been indispensable is a Sharpie. I have a problem with bright lights and shiny things, kind of like my German Shepherd. Anyway, what I like to do is to take the piece of silver and actually mark it with a Sharpie, just so that when I make my scribe line, I can see it a little bit easier. That way I can stay on my line as I'm cutting or as I'm filing or texturing and making sure that I don't go off course and have way too much excess to take off at the very end. This particular ring that I'm going to make is going to be a size 6, and because I'm planning on making it about 4 millimeters wide, I need to cut a piece of metal that's 54.42 millimeters in total length. I will throw the calculation up here on the video, that way you have that. But essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my caliper and stretch it out to 54.4. There's 50, 52, 54.42 was the exact measurement. I'm going to use the set screw here and make it so that my caliper won't slide anymore. Before I make the marking, I'm going to take one side of my metal and make sure that it's completely square. And the way that I do that is I will find an angle gauge, set it to 90 degrees, and then take one end with my scribe and mark a straight line. Now I have a straight line across that I can see really well with my Sharpie marked here and my scribe. So what I'm going to do with that is file it or cut it with my jeweler saw. Since I have a little bit extra, I'm going to actually do some cutting. So I'm putting my dust collection skirt in place. This is a DIY. I took a piece of leather and cut it and then put some grommets in it and screwed it to the bottom of my bench. So all I have to do is pull it out, catches all my dust. I can put it back up and not have to worry about sweeping silver off the floor all the time. This is my jeweler saw. I'm using a 3/0 blade, and this is a new concept saw and I love it. I'll give you some more information about that particular tool later on in a future episode. But anyway, you always want to use some kind of a burr lube on your jeweler saw so that it doesn't get stuck. I'm placing it on the edge of my bench pen, and I'm going to cut just to the right of my scribe line to straighten out the end of my piece of silver so that when I make my measurement for the size of the ring, it doesn't, it's straight. That's about all I'm going to be able to do. There wasn't quite enough of a lip. So instead, I'm going to take my file and I'm going to file it down to my scribe line. Now, one thing about files, they only work in one direction, and that's the forward motion. So if you sat and did this, you're not doing anything but dulling your file. So what you need to do is take your file and go in one direction, make a crisp, clean move, and try to keep your hand as straight as possible. And you notice how I've got the piece of metal clamped to my bench with just my hands. I'm not clenching it really super tight and making my hand hurt. I'm just holding it enough so that it doesn't move all over the place when I use my file. So I've got my filed edge straight. I have my digital caliper, well, my dial caliper, I should say, set. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one leg and put it at the edge that I just straightened it. And I'm going to use that as a guide and scribe a line directly across with the leading edge here. So I'm going to do it a couple of times to make sure that I can see that scribe line through my Sharpie. I'm going to flip it around and I'm going to do another cut with my saw just to the outside or the right of my scribe line. Now this time I'm placing my metal over the hole that I've cut in my bench pen because that's actually going to help me stabilize it and make my cut a lot straighter. So I'm going to start it and I'm putting my fingers around the blade so that I can get a good grip on my piece of metal. And all I'm doing, I'm not pressing forward, I'm just going up and down. Get it started. Make it work like the foot of a sewing machine, the needle going up and down. I'm not putting any forward pressure on it at all, and I'm letting the blade do the work. And as I get to the end, I slow down just a little bit. There you have it. I've got the piece cut. Now, it's not perfectly straight. It never will be because we're human beings. So I'm going to take my file and I'm going to file this edge all the way down to my scribe line here. And yes, I know that noise is awful, but it happens. There's no avoiding it. No matter how hard you try, there is no avoiding it. Okay, so let's double check that. Oh, still got a little ways to go. Whew. There we go, much better. So now I've got the perfect length for my ring. The problem I have now is that I've got this crazy little funky thing here that I don't want on the outside edge of my ring. So I'm going to take my calipers and reset them for 4 millimeters. lock the screw set down, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing I did before, except for I'm going to take the straight edge, which I want to double check first before I go on. And the way I check it is to take my straight edge, or my angle finder here, and put my flat end of the piece up against the top, and I can see that bottom edge there is straight, so I can use that as my guide for my cutting. So go back to my calipers, slide this along the edge. I'm going to do it a couple of times. Sometimes it's easier to pull it than to push it. So now I have my scribe line here, and I'm going to take my jeweler saw once again and cut along that line. Put a little bit of burr lube on the saw, and you'll notice here that I've got it on the most stable part of my bench pen, not over here on the side, because I don't have a lot of room to hold it, and since I'm right-handed I can't do this side. So I'm going to hold it in the middle, and I'm just going to move it as I'm sawing so that I can get a better grip on it. And just like before, I'm going to start off with a little bit of an angle to get it started, pull it down, then I'm going to straighten out, and I'm going to cut just to the right of that line. And after I've sawn a little ways and I feel it kind of touch the back of my bench pen, I'm just going to move it forward a little bit more. And you notice how I'm keeping my finger to the front and back of my blade. That's because I want to be able to hold my metal down on the sides that's been cut and the side that hasn't been cut, so that it doesn't get tangled up and catch my blade and break it. So let's continue. Now I'm getting to a point where I can't really hold on to it so well anymore, so I'm going to change positions here in just a second. So now I'm going to hold it from behind, and I'm going to hold both pieces up against my bench pen as I continue or finish my sawing. Get towards the end and go a little bit faster with shorter strokes to get through the end. Now you noticed I moved my fingers away from holding it like this as I came to the end. And the reason for that is because I don't want to cut myself. Let me tell you, I've done it a million times and cut myself so deep, I didn't think it was ever going to heal. These might be tiny little blades, but let me tell you, they can do some serious damage. So keep your fingers away as much as you possibly can. Figure out a way to move your hand around it so that you're not holding at the point where you're going to be popping through the end of your metal, because if you get it, you're not going to be able to stop it in mid-pull. And 9 times out of 10, it's going to go straight in, grab a hold of your finger, and just slice you right down to the bone. So be very, very, very careful. Okay, on to the next step. So now I've got a pretty jagged line going there, but I'm not going to worry about straightening it out right at this moment, because we can do it a lot easier once it's in the shape of a circle than we can right now. It doesn't matter if you do it before you shape it or after you shape it, just you'll have to do it at some point. Just make sure that you can see your scribe line on the outside of the ring when you're ready to actually file that down and make it a consistent shape. So now we have our blank ready to go. So it's time to take the round nose pliers or your half round pliers, and you're going to bend it. Now, the point of bending it is not to make it in a perfect circle, because all we're trying to do now is get it to the point where we can solder it pretty easily. And it's easier to actually solder if it's in the shape of a D than it is if it's in the shape of a circle. So I like to take mine into the shape of a D. And I work one side and then work the other. And bring them together as close as possible with your pliers. Now, shaped like a D, that's going to be much easier to get these edges to line up and have the planes be flat on the top, flat on the bottom, and not have these funky little bumps that are going to interfere with your soldering. So I'm just going to manhandle it a little bit here and get my edges to line up. I want my joint to line up so closely that if I hold it up to the light, I can't see light shining through the joint. or at least very little of it. And what you want to do is make sure that not only is your joint even from top to bottom in this direction, you also want to turn it this way and make sure that you're not too far this way, too far that way. Get it as straight as you possibly can. And since you've already scribed a line on the outside, it's a real helpful indicator that you're getting it straight and level. So just keep moving it around until you can get those lines matched up. Push it down a little bit, give it some tension so that it kind of holds in place. And I can tell by looking at this one, there's a little bit of a gap, and I'm going to show you a trick on how you can fix that. Now, when you're cutting with a saw or filing with a file, we have a tendency to move our hands in this direction, which means you're not getting a straight line, you're getting a curved line. So you kind of get a little bit of a diagonal. So the way you can fix that so that you don't have this gap at the bottom here and then a nice tight gap joint at the top is to take your saw blade once again and run it through the spot that's tight and see if you can get it to fit. So what I do is I take my saw blade again, I face my joint outwards, and I will put a little bit of burr lube on that, and then I will try to run my saw blade through that joint very slowly and carefully, not to get my finger, all the way through to even up the edges. It kind of acts as sandpaper. And you notice I'm going very gently because I don't want to get my finger. There we go. Now I can see the joint is completely touching. My joint is touching. There was no light coming through it. One thing I did notice is there's some flashing on the bottom. You want to try and get that off if you can. Just take a little piece of sandpaper if you have it, and just kind of get rid of it, because believe it or not, that little tiny bit of flashing can keep your solder from flowing. Okay, looks good. I think we're ready to solder now. So now let's go over to the sink and prep this for soldering. Okay, here we are at my sink, and you can see I've got my ring here. The worst thing you can do is get it all prepped and ready and the joint ready to go, and then throw it up on your charcoal block and start soldering, and dirt gets in the way and it won't solder. So I use an old toothbrush, a little bit of Dawn dish soap, and do a quick clean off. Just a quick scrub. Nothing too crazy, just enough to get the finger oils from trying to manipulate it and get the joint in order, and any dust that might have collected on your bench while you were sawing and getting it cleaned up. Rinse it off really good, make sure you've got all the soap off of it. Then dry it off a bit, and it's ready for soldering. Okay, so we're going to get started here. What you're going to need is some flux and a little bit of hard solder. I was planning on using paste solder for this particular demonstration, but I found that I don't have any. I must have given it away to my students. Anyway, so instead of using paste flux, we're going to use a regular flux, liquid flux, and a pallion of hard solder that I've actually cut from solder wire. If you're using paste flux, the only suggestion I can give you is to make sure that you apply a lot of the paste flux to your joint, because the paste itself has flux built into it, so that doesn't necessarily mean that what you pour out onto your joint is going to be all solder. Some of it's probably 50% of it is going to be flux, and 50% of it is going to be your solder. So I suggest using more than you think you should, because the flux is going to burn away and you might find that you don't have enough solder to do the whole joint. So just be real careful when you're using paste flux. I will say though, paste flux is a great way, or paste solder is a great way to get started with soldering, because it makes placement really easy. But I'm going to show you the quickest and easiest way to set up your soldering station for simple things with liquid flux and with your solder. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to do is I want to apply flux liberally to my joint on my silver. Now, lots of schools will tell you, and lots of different jewelers will tell you different ways to do it. I put it liberally around my joint, and I don't worry too much around the rest of my piece because I'm going to be putting it in the pickle anyway. So as long as your joint area is clean with flux, you shouldn't have any problems. So I'm going to take a pallion that I had pre-cut and place it right on my charcoal block, right there. Then I'm going to take my ring with the joint and put it right on top of the solder, so it's right underneath the joint. That way, when I'm heating it, I'm going to be going in circles like this to get it started to dry out the flux, and then when it gets hot enough to actually make the solder flow, it's going to pull the solder through the joint to where my heat is. Solder will always follow to the hottest point in your flame. So if you can get into the habit of aiming your flame in the area that you want the solder to come up to or come through to, you're going to have much more success. You also need to have a solder pick, and I highly recommend these glasses. These are didymium glasses, and what they do is reduce the orange glare from your torch and helps you see the joint much easier. I don't know if you've noticed, but my camera itself, I took an old pair of these glasses and popped one of the lenses out and put it over my camera lens just so that I'm hoping it will capture less of the orange glare so that you can see the actual solder flowing when it needs to flow. So let's go ahead and get the torch lit. I'm putting my glasses on. I'm wearing my magnifiers because I'm blind as a bat. When you start up your torch, if you have a 2-gas torch, a propane oxygen or acetylene oxygen, you always want to light your propane first, and that's the red dial. So I'm going to turn it on just slightly. I'm going to light it on my igniter, just enough to get it started, and then I'm going to give it a pretty healthy dose of propane. And I'm going to slowly turn on my oxygen until I get a nice neutral flame. Neutral flame is hot blue and then kind of a whitish yellow area, and then you've got this long edge of the flame that is kind of like the heating part. Since this is a fairly decent chunk of silver, I'm going to give it just a little bit bigger flame. Now what I'm listening for is a nice flow of the gas. I don't want to hear it hissing like sss. That means I've got too much of the oxygen flowing, and that's going to be an oxidizing flame, and it could potentially burn your silver, and you won't be able to get the fire scale off even with a pickle. And sometimes the fire burn won't show up until you've actually polished the ring or the earrings or whatever it is that you're making, and it's very difficult to get rid of it. So practice with your flame and make sure you're getting a neutral flame. Now, if you're using a creme brulee torch or a single gas torch, it's actually pulling the oxygen from the ambient air, so you should always have a neutral flame. It's really difficult to not have a neutral flame with a torch like that. In one of my future videos, I'll make sure to show you my Smith acetylene torch that is an ambient air and acetylene torch so that you can see the difference between a dual gas versus a single gas and ambient air. Anyway, let's get to soldering. So one other thing before we get to the soldering. Your sweet spot of your flame is about 1/4 to 1/2 inch from the edge of your inner cone. So this is the hottest part of your flame, and that's where you want to focus your soldering at, because if you go too far out here, it's not hot enough and you're going to be on the metal too long, and it's going to burn your silver or your copper or your gold or whatever it is that you're using. And if you go too close, you're just going to stamp out your flame because it's not going to get enough flow through. So the goal is to position your piece while you're soldering right here in between this area here. And with silver, the faster you get in and get that solder to flow and get out, the more likely you're going to get a solid solder, and the less likely you're going to burn your metal. So here we go. So as you can see, my silver is sitting on top of my solder pallion. I've got my flux on there already, and I'm ready to go. The first thing I want to do is take the edge of my flame and kind of warm it up just a little bit to get that flux to kind of dry, and see how it turned white. It's good to go. So now that I've got the heat on it, I'm going to go straight into that sweet spot and heat that area and keep my flame moving until my solder flows. And there it goes. Done. It goes really, really fast. when you have your flame in the right place and you have a good temperature. So now this is off to the pickle. First, we're going to quench it in some cool water, then put it in the pickle so it doesn't splash and cause problems. And then we're going to move on to shaping it. Okay, so the piece is out of the pickle. Once I take it out of the pickle, I rinse it off in clean water, dry it off real good with a paper towel. You want to make sure to get the inside too, because when you put it on your ring mandrel, you don't want it to be wet. It'll cause your ring mandrel to rust, and you don't want that to happen. First thing I'm looking for when I pull it out of the pickle is to make sure that my solder is gone all the way through the joint, front and back, and it looks good. So now I'm going to take my ring mandrel and a rubber hammer. This happens to be a frets hammer, but you can use a rawhide hammer or any other kind of plastic, rawhide, wood, or rubber hammer in order to shape your ring on your ring mandrel. If you use a metal hammer, it's going to stretch the metal, because metal on metal on metal will cause the metal to stretch. So I'm going to slip it over the end, pull it down as far as I can get it, and then I'm going to take my hammer and start rounding it. Now, you're not going to be able to do this all in one blow. Just take your time and work your way around. Eventually it'll get snug on the ring mandrel. You don't want to do it so snug that it gets stuck, because then you're going to misshape it and stretch it a little bit. Once you have it round, you take it off, take a quick look at it, and since I put it on this way to start with, I want to flip it over and do it again on the other side so that I can make sure that it's even all the way around. I think that looks good. So now you can see my ring is round on all sides. Now the next thing I need to do is I need to file my edges, because my edges are pretty rocky. I wasn't able to cut one side of it perfectly straight, and more than likely the other side wasn't perfectly straight either. So now I'm going to take this in the simplest way I know how and sandpaper it down so that my edges are straight. And this is my trick. I found this little clipboard. I cut some pieces of sandpaper. I start with 220. Actually, no, this is 120. This is 220. And then I'll work my way to a 400 grit. First thing I want to do is take the ring and move it in a figure 8. To make your visualization of a straight edge easier, take that trick I showed you earlier with the Sharpie. Color your edges, the side that you're going to put down on the sandpaper. Do your figure 8s. The reason you do your figure 8s is to make sure that you're hitting all the angles and edges, and I'm kind of twisting and turning it a little bit as I go. And then I'm going to turn it over and look to see where my Sharpie edges are still showing, and that just tells me that it's not even, it's not straight. So I'm going to keep doing it till it's straight. A little bit more, so I'm going to twist it a little bit. I've got a little here, and a little there, so I'm going to do a little bit more. I still have a little bit. Just keep working it down until you get it with a completely straight edge. It's the easiest way to do it. A little bit. Just a tiny, tiny little bit more. Perfect. Now you can see that I've got no Sharpie edges on there. Perfect. So now I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing with this side. I'm going to mark it with the Sharpie. Ugh. A lot harder to do when people are watching. Okay, so flip it to the other edge. Check it. Ooh, that one went much faster. Obviously that side was straighter than the other. A little bit more. Perfect. So now that's done, I'm going to dump my sanding dust into my tray. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to hide my seam. I don't want to be able to see it on the outside here or on the inside there. So I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to take my sanding stick that I showed you earlier with the 320, and I am going to sand over my joint right here. The idea is to try and make that joint completely invisible. You don't want to be able to see it. So, unlike a sandpaper, you can go in both directions, but if you get in the habit of just using one direction, you're more likely to use your file correctly. So, just stick with it that way. It becomes meditative, I promise. So, that's the outside. Now that I've got the outside joint basically hidden, I'm going to go ahead and go all the way around the entire ring, just to make it consistent all the way around. If you have a hard time holding the piece in your fingers like this, you can always set it on the edge of your bench pen and stabilize it there. Gives you a little bit of extra leverage. Or you can do it on the inside here. I have a couple of notches kind of cut out of my pen just because I've, over the years, figured out the best placement for the pieces when I'm sanding or filing or sawing or grinding or texturing sometimes. So as you work with your bench pen, you'll start to figure out the best ways to make your little notches and use it. Okay, so I've gone all the way around the ring with the rough sanding. Now I want to do the inside of my ring too, because I don't want to be able to see my joint down here either. What I did is I went to my local hardware store and bought some dowels, and I just did the same thing as I did with the paint sticks, and I took the piece of sandpaper and wrapped it around and put some rubber bands on it to hold it in place. That way I can get on the inside of my ring fairly easy. Ooh, this one's close. Get it over the rubber bands. And I'm just gonna go in and out around the joint. This is a 400 grit sandpaper. I usually try to sand up to 400 grit before I do any polishing, because that makes it a little bit easier to get the scratches out, and it makes the polishing go much faster. So I want to check. The joint's pretty good. I can still kind of see it, so I'm going to turn the ring around and do a little bit of sanding this way. See if I can get rid of that. If you don't have a sanding stick, you can just wrap the sandpaper around your finger, stick your finger in there and do it. That works just as well. Or if you have a sanding drum, you can use that on your flex shaft. And the sanding drum kind of looks like this. Stick it in your flex shaft. Put it inside your ring like that, and then you can spin it and it goes pretty quickly. You can do the same thing on the outside. Since this is a 400, I'm going to go ahead and do all of the outside here too. And since I only went to 120 grit on this, I'm going to actually do my edges too, just a little bit, not a lot. Got that side. Got that side. So here's the true test. So now, remember how I told you that the measurements will actually be a perfect size every time? Here's your true test. This is my sizing mandrel. If I measured correctly and made this blank the correct length, I should have exactly a size 6, regardless of the thickness of my metal. It's close, so I must not cut it exactly. It's about, it's a 6 actually. Pretty good. Not too bad. If it tends to be a little bit small, that's okay, because what you can do is put it on your mandrel, press it down, flip it over, press it down a little bit more, and what that does is it gives it a little bit of stretch. So now when I test it, I am right at a 6. And you can keep working it down. If pulling on it down like that doesn't stretch it enough, put it back on the mandrel, pull down with your fingers, and hammer. And turn at the same time. That should tighten it around the mandrel. Then you're going to want to get it off of there. Loosen it up, get it off. Flip it over and do the same thing. Pull it down a little bit with your finger. Hammer and turn it. Pull it off the mandrel. Let's test the size again. Yep, exactly a 6. Perfect. So, the last step in this is to hallmark it. If you have a bent ring hallmarker, I'll show you what that looks like. Looks like this. So you set it up like that, take your hammer and put your 925 stamp in there, and you're ready to go. Now, if you don't have a bent stamp and you only have a straight stamp like this, do it while it's flat before you solder it. And then make sure it's really impressed deeply. That way when you do your sandpapering and your filing, you don't sand it or file it right off. So the last step of this would be just to polish it. And there's a couple of ways to do that. The easiest way is to put it in a rotary tumbler with some borax powder, like the 20 mil team powder, and some steel shot, and just let it tumble for 8 to 10 hours. Or you can hand polish it using polishing mops like this and some polishing compounds, which usually come in the sticks. I'm not going to do that today because this is just a sample, but all of my rings I polish by hand usually. I don't usually tumble them, only because I'm kind of a geek that way. I like to hand polish everything. This is a ring that I hand polished after I did my engraving on it, so to me, the hand polish seems to last a little bit longer and more resistant to scratching. It still scratches, but it's not as easily scratched as if I just tumbled it. So that's how you make a ring out of 20 gauge sheet. So today we turned this into this. We made a ring. You should be so proud of yourself. You did it in what? 30 minutes or so? That's actually very, very good. So you should be proud of yourself. If you like this video, please click the subscribe button and turn on the notifications so you know when I post new videos, and give me a comment, leave me a like. I'd really appreciate your feedback to see what kind of videos you'd like to see in the future. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.